Hello, I'm Sean Khozin from the Food and Drug Administration. And here is my introductory slide, also my disclosures, all on one slide for the sake of efficiency. And I only have one slide to present, and what I'd like to do is to talk about and demonstrate how we do things currently in drug development. And this is the view of the drug development enterprise and all the data that is involved to take a molecule from the bench to what we call bedside, that is for the patient. And you'll notice that just the way I described it, the paradigm is really designed around the molecule. Around the innovation, the drug, the biologic that you're trying to take from the bench to the bedside, from the preclinical stage all the way to clinical development and to the post-market space if the drug or the biologic is approved. And it's not really aligned with the patient's journey, which was brought up by Amy and Mia, which is a different longitudinal experience. And the way that we incorporate that experience into this paradigm is through vertical integration in two different buckets. For example, we have 3 different phases of clinical development, and each phase has a different, quote unquote, buckets of patients. And then once the drug is approved, there are other buckets of patients vertically oriented. And the data that is being collected is different depending on which bucket the patient belongs in, even though it could be the same patient. Because again, the orientation is towards the product, not the patient. So I think we have a great opportunity right now as we talk about data standards to start to re-engineer this paradigm in a way that it's reconfigured and reoriented towards a longitudinal experience of the patient rather than the product. And then the product can be vertically oriented and embedded within that longitudinal journey. So I think that's a fundamental conceptual opportunity that we have as we envision what we're trying to accomplish with better data standards and with automation and with AI. Because to feed the old habits may not be the most efficient way of moving forward, and we may not actually get the most bang for our buck in terms of bringing new therapies and innovations to patients who need them. So I'd like to walk through this drug development paradigm, and both with the intent of describing the types of data that we generate and the data that specifically the FDA receives for supporting its regulatory decisions, including drug approval decisions. So in the preclinical space, obviously there's a lot of basic science research that from the FDA's perspective, we're not typically involved in. And the data standards in that domain are very, very heterogeneous. And in some cases, there are standards that are being used from other places to accommodate conducting basic science research. And I'm not going to go into the details of that. But as we get closer to the clinical phase of development, when a product shows promise, there are a series of data requirements that have to be generated in order to justify taking the drug or the biologic into clinical development. And that includes, for example, target validation studies, the preclinical pharmacokinetic studies that have to be done for regulatory purposes, and also for the dose finding studies that would take place in phase 1 in early clinical development. So there are, as we shift more towards the IND stage, the data standards get better. However, even in that, let's say, bucket of preclinical activities, there's a lot of heterogeneity. For example, you may have heard in the past 5 to 6 years that the majority of target validation studies are not reproducible. That is a very true phenomenon because of how the data is generated and the conditions under which the data are generated and the data themselves are not standardized. So that's excluding fraud, which probably is not a primary contributor to the fact that most target validation studies are not reproducible. It is the heterogeneity in how we conduct these experiments and the lack of data standards that are probably the primary contributing factor. So that's an area that probably needs further discussion and focus. And once we go through the preclinical stage, from in vitro to in vivo studies, we move into the clinical phase. And it's at that stage that the FDA gets involved. As many of us know, in order to conduct clinical trials and to experiment with human subjects, you have to submit an IND to the FDA. And the FDA has 30 days to decide if the study is safe to proceed. And once the study is deemed safe to proceed, then the clinical trial ensues and the data is collected. And typically, we have a sequential way of collecting data, as you know, into 3 distinct arbitrary phases of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1 being the stage where we collect data that can inform, for example, the proper dose to take into later phase studies. And when we look at the IND stage of clinical development, the data that typically flows across the clinical development enterprise outside of the confines of the sponsor's boundaries, for example, whether this sponsor is a pharmaceutical company or a research institution, the data that flows is primarily safety data. And that's because the FDA has a requirement that in order to conduct these studies, once the FDA greenlights the study, what we ask for return are 7 and 15-day data on the safety of the product. And these are only very, very serious events, not all the safety data. And that information flows across the clinical development enterprise. Investigators have to review these safety reports, and also the FDA has to review the data coming in. In fact, at the IND stage, the only authority that the FDA has is over safety. We cannot put a clinical study on hold because we believe that the drug is not going to be effective. We don't have that authority at the IND stage. It's only at the NDA BLA stage since 1962, where Congress gave the FDA the authority to preside over efficacy. But at the IND stage, we preside over safety only. And the way we do that is by reviewing 7 and 15-day expedited safety reports and also annual reports. You may have noticed when we look at the bottom part of this slide that I've been saying reports a lot, not data. It's because the data assets available to us at the preclinical and the clinical stage of drug development, and the clinical IND stage being the most active part of clinical development, because as we know, there's what we call endearingly the valley of death, where most INDs and clinical development programs fail and never make it to the NDA BLA stage. So at the most active part of clinical development, the data assets that we have are very minimal, because these 7-day and 15-day reports and these annual reports are reports that are basically tables and narratives that are distributed across the ecosystem. Investigators have to review them. The FDA is tasked with reviewing these reports again to ensure the safety of patients enrolled in clinical trials. Very recently, we digitized this 7 and 15-day process, which is now being implemented across the FDA, so that we'll, for the first time, are going to be getting data. And that data model, we had to essentially extrapolate from the data model that exists in the post-market space, which is called E2B. And the reason we did that was because we didn't want to invent a new data standard. We just wanted to pick a data standard, even though in this case it was probably not the most ideal data standard. However, it meant that neither the FDA nor any of the companies that submit information/data now to the FDA had to reinvent the wheel and build new capabilities for transmitting data. So we aligned the IND stage of pre-market safety data transmission to the FDA. We aligned it with the post-market data standards, which is called E2B. By doing that, we basically are using the same infrastructure that we have at the FDA, and companies can also use the same infrastructure available to them. So there's a Federal Register notice that will be going out soon, which will provide more details on the nature of the new digital pre-market safety standards, and we're working on a guidance document that will be published hopefully early next year. And we're envisioning that by the end of 2019, the FDA will have moved, transition completely into a digital pre-market safety infrastructure for reviewing and receiving data. And that will be actually the first time that we could, in fact, do safety signal detection in the pre-market IND stage, because currently, again, it's deductive. It is not analytic. So there is really no safety signal detection in the pre-market arena. So, again, looking at it this way, we're benchmarking where we are now. And one of the main reasons I wanted to do this is to frame the discussion moving forward, and also to look at the opportunities that we have to make this system more efficient, more analytically driven, and more standardized. So once we get through the IND stage, and if the drug is showing promise in terms of efficacy, and it has shown to be safe, depending on what the indication is. In oncology, obviously our tolerance for safety is a little higher than if you are, for example, developing a drug to address hyperlipidemia. But once that point in the clinical development program is reached, the sponsor submits an NDA or a BLA, and then that's the first time that actually the FDA gets data for its review, to conduct its reviews, and also for making other regulatory decisions. And that's also the first time that the FDA looks at efficacy data, because the authority of the FDA switches to both safety and efficacy once the NDA or the BLA is submitted to the FDA. And traditionally, we used to get data in a variety of different formats, in a variety of different standards. Every company, every sponsor had their own data standard, basically. And a few years ago, we started working with a consortium called CDDISC that many of you are aware of, to come up with a data standard for the NDA BLA stage of drug development, so that the data coming into the FDA is all harmonized and based on the same standard. So CDISC is the name of that standard, and right now, almost all of the applications that we receive at the NDA BLA stage are CDISC compliant. And that's a great thing, because we can now almost automate a lot of the functions during the review process, because the data can be linked, and certain review processes can be automated. But also we can start to look at data in a more holistic way, in terms of looking across several different studies, doing meta-analyses, and also we are thinking about using the data we have to train algorithms that can be open source and help the entire drug development community. And that's one of the things that I spend a lot of my time on as the Director of Information Exchange and Data Transformation, which is our data science program at the FDA. So CDISC has been very, very useful in that sense. However, CDISC is still remains an afterthought in clinical development, meaning when these clinical studies are being conducted for a variety of different reasons, mainly because it's hard to know if your clinical development program is actually going to be successful. So when we are in the phase 1, phase 2 stage, we think very little about data standards. It's not until we get closer to phase 3 where we start to think about CDISC and data standards because the data will have to eventually come to the FDA. And that is a lost opportunity, because if we start to think about properly structuring data and actually capturing data early in development, according to proper data standards, in this case CDISC, we can really streamline the entire process and be able to use data from early phase clinical studies in a much more meaningful way, because right now a lot of those data sets are only fit for one purpose, and it's only the purpose of that clinical development program. And the reason, again, is that data standards are typically an afterthought at that stage of development, and it's not until we get closer to late stage, phase 3, where we start thinking about data standards. And we have seen cases even today where even the phase 3 study is conducted without really thinking about any data standards, and the sponsor takes the data, aggregates them, cleans it up, reformats the data into CDISC. Basically, that could be a very, very difficult and complicated data mapping exercise, prepares the data for submission to the FDA. And what we do in order to validate the data integrity, when it comes to validating data integrity, the data standard itself can mean very little, because especially if the data wasn't captured according to those standards. And since still in clinical development, we're not capturing the data to any pre-specified standards, the fact that we're getting CDISC data, it helps us streamline our reviews. But in terms of validating the data integrity, we're still doing the same thing that we have been doing for many, many years and decades, which is source document verification. Basically, we trace the data elements back to their source once we do our clinical site inspections, and that's how we validate data integrity. So that's very important to keep in mind, because that's why, and it was brought up earlier today, that data quality is everything. So data quality, again, is different at data standard, because, again, we have seen pristine CDISC data that comes to us that on the surface it looks great. However, after inspections, we realize that actually the integrity of the data is questionable. We actually discover many protocol deviations, data anomalies, even in the most kind of structured and highly controlled phase 3 clinical trials that where the data comes to the FDA. So the concept of data standard helps, but it helps a lot more if we were able to actually use those standards when it comes to collecting the data and actually at the point of data collection. So another thing to mention is that CDISC is primarily a clinical data standard. It doesn't really address genomic data, and there are other standards that have organically developed, and this was brought up earlier, that there are, and interestingly enough, there are incentives out there that have really organically led to the emergence of communication data standards for genomic data. And that's been very useful in terms of sending data from point A to point B, making sure that everyone is speaking the same language because there are incentives built in. Obviously, in healthcare delivery, the point of routine care, unfortunately, there are not similar incentives for exchanging clinical data. But that's a separate story, and that's something that obviously we've been thinking a lot about in terms of how to best capture data from electronic health records. And there are a series of innovations that are helping us move in that direction in terms of structuring electronic health record data into a proper format that is of high quality. And again, the standard in those cases could be anything we decide. Once we are sure about the data integrity, we can map it to CDISC or other data standards. So in terms of genomic data, there's a lot of work that can be done. Currently, the way we handle genomic data for the most part, just focusing on oncology right now, is we ask companies and sponsors to give us a spreadsheet with basically the relevant genomic data outputs. As an example, if it's a drug that is targeting a certain mutation, let's say EGFR, we essentially ask companies to send us a spreadsheet with all the patients that were in the study and tell us if the patient was mutation positive, negative. If yes, what was the mutation? So we actually do not get the raw genomic data because of the complexities involved in data transmission and lack of appropriate standardizations and technology backbones for analyzing such data as part of regulatory decision making. So if the NDA and the BLA meet the regulatory requirements for safety and efficacy, the drug is, or the biologic is approved, and we move into post-market phase. And it's at that stage that we are interested in knowing more about the safety of the product, especially in oncology, where we've seen drugs in recent years that have very high rates of tumor response / efficacy. So clinical trials in oncology for drugs that have been showing unprecedented tumor responses are typically small because you don't have to power your study to essentially measure your treatment effect. You know, we don't need, if your treatment, if you have a tumor response rate of, let's say, 60 to 70%, there's no reason to conduct a clinical study of more than 100 or 200 patients, even if it's a randomized study, because that the mathematical principles of frequent statistics tell us that if the effect size is high, your sample size is low. So what we've found are now we're, due to the fact that oncology drugs are getting better, effect sizes are larger, our clinical trials are smaller, and now there's a greater need to understand the post-market experience, to be able to understand that the longitudinal experience, the journey of the patient. And that's one of the areas where real-world evidence has been very, very useful and promising in terms of following the patient's longitudinal journey. The way we're doing that right now is through commitments and requirements that we typically have on companies, depending on the nature of the drug and what we've seen at the NDA or the BLA stage, and also spontaneous reports that are sent to the FDA, basically by physicians, by patients, by anyone who can go to our website and find out how to send us a spontaneous report on the safety of a drug that they're taking or their physician is giving them. So that is a continuous process, and we have a continuous cycle for post-market safety, surveillance, and pharmacovigilance. So as you can see, there are many opportunities to streamline the post-market phase of clinical development. and starting to think about the fact that if we're interested in the patient's journey, why not follow the same patient from the time that they enter the clinical trial until the post-market phase of clinical development, assuming that the patient is still alive. Obviously, in many cases in oncology, unfortunately, the overall survival remains limited. However, what we're really interested in when it comes to data standards is having an ecosystem, a milieu that allows us to really start to trace and track the patient's longitudinal journey. And if we do this right, hopefully we'll have a drug development paradigm that looks very different like this in terms of being product-oriented versus being patient-oriented. The orientation of this paradigm is largely designed to meet the requirements of collecting data for the product, not necessarily the patient. Again, that's a generalization, and I believe I'm running out of time, and it's a good thing I only had one slide. Thanks.